Welcome everyone to, I think it's the 8th class in this series on Tathagata essence, Buddha nature. So let's go ahead and start as we usually do with a few prayers. Put those on the screen. So again, we'll begin with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha that we'll just do once together. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. We're having a technical issue here. We don't have the prayers on the screen in the Gompa, so let me go ahead and continue. I think some of you know the mandala offering prayer, and then the refuge and bodhicitta we'll do right after this. Sorry, we're having some conversation. Okay, so the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta. We'll do this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jantu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola panchir sangye druparsho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu pardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola panchir sangye duparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation before we begin. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and then to set our motivation together. So for the first few minutes, we'll just meditate on the breath, again, trying to develop some stability of mind. You can work with the breath whatever way you prefer. And then I will lead you in setting motivation in just a few minutes. So let's begin with meditating on the breath. Now let's set our motivation. And I think to do this today, let's review the 4 causes that we examined last week. Again, this is the second presentation of these 10 presentations on Buddha nature. And these speak to the causes that will result in the Dharmakaya, the achievement of complete enlightenment. And we just engaged in one of them, developing samadhi, meditative stabilization. This is kind of, again, this developed mind that is able to be single-pointed focused. And every time that we engage in that, we are planting the seeds to eventually have a very strong, very stable mind that we can use as a basis for meditation. Another cause that we saw was faith in the Mahayana. Every one of us has been exposed to the teachings of the Mahayana through the kindness of the Buddha and all of our amazing teachers. And we've developed some conviction in that path. Let go to some degree of our attachment to this world. Have deep conviction that the Mahayana does set out a very clear path to attaining Buddhahood for ourselves and for all sentient beings. And this is an important cause to be able to actualize our Buddha nature and to become a Buddha. We can just reflect on the importance of that right now. And then obviously one of the other 4 causes is the wisdom realizing emptiness. As we've already seen in this text, this is such a crucial mind to develop, the realization that we have to have. The wisdom that knows emptiness at the deepest level, but is developed through even our conceptual understanding of emptiness. This removes all of the false views of a self, especially the ignorance that is keeping us in an unenlightened state. So again, just reflect very briefly on that cause as well. That wisdom realizing emptiness that is so crucial, so important. And then lastly, the 4th cause is great compassion, which is important in terms of developing this mind that is far-reaching, that wishes to benefit all sentient beings, that is no longer enchanted by samsara, but moreover is also not enticed by the peace of nirvana, the solitary peace that those on the fundamental vehicle path achieve and strive to achieve. It's a mind that is driven by this desire to benefit all sentient beings, to do whatever it takes to help them to be free from suffering and to find true peace and happiness. And it's this last one in particular that we can then channel into our motivation for being here tonight. Great compassion is the root of bodhicitta, driven by that strong desire to help all sentient beings to the greatest degree. We unite it with this aspiration to develop ourselves to the greatest degree, to become a Buddha, so we then can enact the welfare of others, having achieved our own welfare. So reflecting on these 4 causes and how they contribute to our ability to achieve the goal that we are striving for, the Dharmakaya, the state of Buddhahood, that state in which we will be able to work spontaneously, effortlessly for the welfare of all beings, and hold that motivation for tonight, throughout this life, even beyond this life, all the way to accomplishing that goal. Okay, good. And welcome everyone. I already did a brief review of these four causes, but I'm going to go ahead and start there actually to make sure that we're sort of all on the same page. Again, we began this text with looking at the three jewels in terms of their resultant state and understanding that this is what we need to accomplish eventually. Let me see if I can get that's not what I wanted to put up there. I wanted to put up a chart, and I have to move this over a little bit. Let me see if I can get it. Oh, I just closed something. That may not be a good thing. Let's see. There it is. Oh, we'll see. I think that was what I closed. So we'll hopefully be able to get this up there on the screen, get it to a decent size. Oops, too big. Let's go to chart 2. Most of you have these charts. This is what we went through last week. The first of the 10 presentations had to do with the nature. I'm not going to review that. You have the chart to be able to review that. What's on the screen now are the second presentation of cause. And we just meditated on these four causes that purify the lineage, purify our Buddha nature. And then they have analogies that work with them. I won't review that tonight. But recall that these four overcome four respective obstacles. So for faith in the Mahayana Dharma, this is the antidote to having hatred or disdain or disbelief in the Mahayana Dharma. And then if we can carry over to the next column, we see that there are those with an attachment to psychic existence who are in that category of really not subscribing to the Mahayana, not being motivated by it to practice this path. And so again, these all line up 1 through 4 across the board. We're going to get into them a little bit tonight when we talk about the result, because there's a corresponding result for each of these four causes. But we see that essentially, what's been identified as the four obstacles, kind of towards the middle there, again, hatred towards the Mahayana Dharma, views of the self, fear of cyclic existence, and no concern for sentient beings. And we talk about them with these very specific examples in that column, that next column. And we went through that last week. Again, I'm not going to review that in as much detail tonight. But I just wanted to point out, because there was a little bit of discussion after class last week, it's not to say that those are the only people that have those obstacles. We obviously can have those obstacles without fitting neatly into those categories. That all of us to some degree are affected by having a view of the self, are affected by having not as much concern for others as what is ideal. But we're all works in progress trying to remove these faults, these obstacles. But we see that the four antidotes, or the four, causes that are mentioned there, are really very effective in doing that. So if we have great faith in the Mahayana Dharma, then we don't fall into that extreme of having some sort of neglect or disdain of the Mahayana. And then the wisdom realizing emptiness obviously overcomes all of the views of the self, and eventually the root ignorance. And samadhi, or meditative stabilization, removes the fears of cyclic existence, because it gives us this safe container in which to practice, because it removes some of the more manifest afflictions, so we don't have the ensuing suffering from all of those. And then the fourth one, great compassion. This is how we antidote the lack of concern for sentient beings. So what we're going to be looking at tonight is the next topic, the third presentation, which is called result. So these are the results of having put these causes into their kind of full-fledged, practice through our own, practice of the Dharma. So we're going to see them corresponding, kind of working across the chart. And I do want to review the chart before we get into the text. I think it's kind of useful, sort of sets the stage and gives us an ability to kind of have our minds in the right place in terms of what we're going to be looking at. So for results, these are essentially the results of having practiced those causes in terms of the attainment of the Dharmakaya, the truth body of a Buddha. So let's look at the very first column after that, where it says the perfections that are the result of purification by way of those four causes that I just looked at, okay? First is the perfection of purity. This means having that purity that we talk about in terms of the nature truth body. The kind of natural purity that is always there for our minds as well as all phenomena, which is their lack of inherent existence. But then moreover, the adventitious purity, the complete freedom from all that obscures the mind currently. Number two, the perfection of highest self. This is kind of a strange word because there, we're in a process of negating the self through the wisdom of emptiness, right? But we're negating a false self. And that idea of a no self is actually held to be the highest self. The highest seeing is no seeing. The highest self is no self. We're going to see this as we get into this more. Number three, which is the product of our samadhi, our meditative stabilization, is the highest bliss. The bliss that is the resultant state of buddhahood, which is, again, having removed even the subtler obscurations that cause you to not have the full experience of a Buddha. Even those on the higher stages of development on the Mahayana path still lack that. Even though they have very blissful states of existence, they haven't achieved the highest bliss. Number four is the perfection of permanence. By permanence here, we mean kind of a stability where one can continue to abide in the state of Buddhahood, enacting the welfare of others without ever diverting from that. So it's got a more of a flavor of eternalism to it to some degree, but we'll see that again when we get into it in more detail. So we see in the next column then, and I'll go through some more information on those. Don't think that that's all you're going to hear about those tonight. You'll understand those four a lot better by the time we're finished tonight. We see that in the next column are the corresponding causes that I pretty much went through already. Again, from faith in the Mahayana Dharma, developing that deep conviction, we eventually attain the perfection of purity, the nature truth body that has those elements of purity. From the wisdom realizing emptiness or selflessness, we have the perfection of the highest self, the fully developed wisdom truth body that has that wisdom knowing emptiness all the time, never parting from that meditative equipoise. Number three, from meditative stabilization, the perfection of highest bliss. Again, especially when we unite that stable mind with the other realizations of emptiness, conventional phenomena, compassion, what have you, we are able to achieve the greatest bliss through that deep meditative state. And then number four, from great compassion, the perfection of permanence, the ability to attain that state where you're not abiding in nirvana, the solitary peace, nor are you abiding in samsara. You are able to have this stable state that you can rely upon in order to continue to benefit others. Now, what we see in the next column is essentially the same people that we saw in the previous chart. Remember, we looked at them last week. First were the people who have desire for samsara, having generated faith in the Mahayana, having kind of taken that antidote to heart, they give up attachment to samsara. They engage in the path, and they attain the result, highest purity, which again is the two purities of the nature truth body, freedom from natural stains, again, because all phenomena have no natural stain, true existence. Moreover, our minds have freedom from adventitious stains, the afflictive and knowledge obstructions, again, which are the sum total of everything that needs to be removed from our minds. When that has been attained, then complete purity is there. That's the perfection of purity. Number two, a person with wrong views of a self. Remember, these are the people who have kind of not developed a correct view of the self due to the tenets that they follow, especially like those who are Kartikas, Forders, those who are outside the Buddhist path. So this says, having meditated on the perfection of wisdom, the wisdom realizing emptiness, those people come to realize that the two selflessnesses, the selflessness of persons, which again is the lack of an inherently existent person, and the selflessness of phenomena, the lack of inherently existent phenomena other than person. And they also, of course, realize the selflessness of that selflessness. I talked about this a little bit previously, the emptiness of emptiness. Even emptiness itself, the antidote, lacks inherent existence. So not only do we realize the selflessness that counteracts all these wrong views of a self, we even realize the emptiness of that selflessness, that it too doesn't exist inherently. And so again, this is whereby all wrong views regarding a self of persons and a self of phenomena are abandoned. Therefore, highest self is no self, as I said previously, the ultimate Dharmakaya. So when we attain that state of full realization of emptiness, we're abiding in the place of highest self because there is no conception of a self whatsoever that would arise in the space of that wisdom. Number 3 there on the chart, a person with strong fear of samsara. This is the person, again, who is generally identified as the hearers on the fundamental vehicle path, who have a strong fear of cyclic existence, and therefore they strive to attain their own solitary peace. So it says here, those people, by practicing the perfection of concentration, overcome the two obscurations, eventually again overcoming those same two, the afflictive and knowledge obscurations. And upon having overcome even again this mental body, I alluded to that briefly earlier, even when hearers and solitary realizers attain their full state of arhatship, again, arhatship is when they have completely removed all the afflictive obstructions. They have not yet removed the knowledge obstructions that keep them from being a Buddha. So they attain what's called a mental body. And even high-level bodhisattvas have a mental body. Those on the pure grounds, remember the last 3 grounds, those bodhisattvas have removed all the afflictive obstructions. And they have what's called a mental body, which is a very subtle body that is due to the fact that there's still some contamination in the mind. They don't yet have the perfect body of a Buddha and the bliss that comes with that. Obviously, they're free of all of the coarse suffering and what have you that occurs on the basis of karma and delusions, but they have not yet attained this very subtle state, which is again the primary cause of it is having this deep meditative concentration. What we saw last week was called the treasury of space meditation. And so again, we'll look at that in a moment, but this is how they attain this uncontaminated highest bliss of Buddhahood, whereby the fear of samsara is overcome. Again, that extreme of abiding in samsara is no longer possible for somebody, obviously, who's attained the Dharmakaya, the state of Buddhahood. The last one in that column, number 4, a person with no concern for the welfare of others. Again, what was highlighted in the previous presentation, number 2, cause, was this pertain to solitary realizers, the other practitioners of the fundamental vehicle. Again, both the hearers and the solitary realizers are striving for their own liberation, their own solitary peace, nirvana. But for some reason in this, they're identified as being primarily those who lack this concern for the welfare of all beings. These beings obviously need to generate great compassion, as it says here on the chart, to develop concern for others, and permanently abides enacting the 2 welfares. Again, the only way to enact both welfares is to be in a state where you are no longer abiding in samsara, but you're also not abiding in the solitary peace of nirvana. This is what we mean, as I explained previously, by non-abiding nirvana. Non-abiding nirvana is equivalent to the state of Buddhahood, because you're not abiding in the solitary peace of nirvana that the fundamental vehicle practitioners strive for, nor are you abiding in samsara any longer. Of course, Buddhas continue to manifest in samsara in order to benefit others, but they don't have any of the causes that lead them to continue to be in samsara. Now, probably what I should have started with was this last column, but having explained what I did, perhaps this last column will make more sense. The presentation of result, this 3rd presentation, the purpose of it is that it shows that the result of purifying the lineage, again, our Buddha nature, of the 4 obstructions leads to the resultant 4 perfect purities of a Buddha. Again, those 4 obstructions were the 4 hindrances in the previous presentation. I talked about them briefly. A strong desire for solid. Let me go back to that chart and make sure I'm saying them correctly. Hatred towards the Mahayana and so on. Lack of concern for others, views of the self, and so on. Those 4 obstructions are overcome through these causes that we looked at, and the 4 perfect purities are attained. By the way, by perfection here, we do call them the perfection. These aren't equivalent to the same perfections that we see normally, the 6 perfections. The perfections here refer to the most kind of precious or perfect forms of these factors, which exist only in the state of a Buddha. I mean, they're part and parcel of the whole thing of being a Buddha. The perfections themselves are not really perfect until one attains Buddhahood. But they're not the same in terms of what we talked about in Lam Rim teachings and so on as the 6 perfections. Okay, so this is the purpose of this presentation, to show how those 4 causes lead to purifying the 4 obstructions and thereby attaining the result of these 4 perfect purities. And then it says the fact that the mind by its nature by nature pure, and that the stains are adventitious, is shown by way of indicating that perfect purity is attainable through causes that purify the mind or lineage of stains. So it's kind of giving this idea that you can achieve this state of these four perfect uh, purities, perfect purity, perfect um, view, and so on, highest self, all of these. You can attain those through the process of engaging in these causes. Why? Once more, because the mind is fundamentally clear, doesn't have any of these stains inherently, and the stains themselves are adventitious. They're only there because we haven't created the causes to overcome them. So again, these are the same 2 points that keep getting hit on again and again in this text. I did mention that I wanted to say a little bit about this treasury-like stabilization that was talked about last week. Let's see if I can get to that. Not sure I'm going to be able to. One of the problems with this, that's for later. That's a different thing. I didn't, again, can't tell what the problem is I'm having from home because I've got a little menu at the top of my thing that wasn't allowing me to get to these files. Let me see if I can get to them through here. 21 categories. Sorry. Here it is. Okay. So this was again presented last week, and there were some questions in the discussion, and I said I would do what I could to find out on this. One of the commentaries that I did a search on actually did address this question. A student asked, this is a Geshe Ngundru, Sonam Ngundru. He said, "What in answer to this question, what is the antidote of the space treasury samadhi? Our mind of wishing that all sentient beings may be free of suffering is weak currently. Later on, at a higher level, this mind becomes stable. And the stability of this mind is what I would say is the space treasure-like samadhi." We can talk about this from the point of view of the example that's being used here, right, of a treasury and the meaning of that. The example is that previously there were monarchs who had room for storing their treasures. And if one opens those, rooms and what have you, there would be these seemingly limitless treasures, this limitless like space. So that they'd have these huge, areas where all these treasures would be kept. This is the example. The meaning here of that example is that sentient beings are inexhaustible and space-like, right? We can't even get our heads around how many beings exist, even in this world, much less in all of samsara. So it says, someone who has great compassion with these limitless space-like sentient beings and wishes them to be free from suffering has something very precious in his or her continuum, enabling them to achieve the highest attainments, which are also limitless like space. So it can either refer to sentient beings or the results of great compassion. I found it kind of interesting, his answer, because it wasn't presented in relation to great compassion because that was the fourth cause, right? This was the third cause, the space-like treasury of samadhi. But nonetheless, I think it makes some sense. He says, on this level, compassion is totally stable, which is why it is called a samadhi. This is how I would read it. The text doesn't explain it at this time. I think it might be explained later on in the way I explained it. Anyway, he goes on to say, this is really, his own version of why this is kind of like a treasury. But the idea is, again, if we attain that very deep, stable, meditative mind, then anything can rest within it. That's why concentration is emphasized as a very important skill for us on our path, because then we can meditate on the wisdom realizing emptiness, or we can put that aside and meditate on great compassion, or we can put those aside and meditate on any of the topics of the Lam and develop realizations on all of them. So we see how important it is to have kind of very vast, deep concentrated state. And so, and that's what he said this was essentially referring to. Okay, so now as a second part of this, I want to go to my slides and share with you. You do have, again, a PDF file with these slides, so you can take a look at them after as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at the slides that were in last week's presentation. Again, I didn't get to introducing these last week. This is what Geshe Loden says in his book, Fundamental Potential for Enlightenment, which does, again, it's a nice commentary on the 10 presentations and the other topic we're going to be looking at later in this course, the 9 similes. He says there are four results that arise from the four causes mentioned above. The four results are transcendental purity. Again, he called it transcendental, which is similar in meaning to perfection. The word for perfection essentially means to transcend, to go beyond, to go to the other shore. So anyway, transcendental self or highest self, transcendental bliss, and transcendental permanence. Go to the next slide. Number one, a Buddha's truth body, the Dharmakaya again, has transcendental purity because it is pure by nature, and that's the first aspect of it, is everything once more is pure by nature. Nothing has any stain of inherent existence. And because it is free of the predispositions of the delusions. Again, the predispositions or any of the obscurations that are in the mind, they don't exist inherently. They're there adventitiously. They can be removed. So this is the state of Buddhahood. You've got both purities, natural purity and the purity of the adventitious states, because you will have completely removed all of those obscurations. Number two, the highest self. The truth body transcends self because it has a complete pacification of conceptual elaborations regarding truly existent non-self or the true existence of the permanent type of self that's asserted by the Porters, or any view of self for that matter. But these are the two that were looked at previously. The Forders, again, those outside the Buddhist path that believe that the self is a functioning thing, that it is permanent, which of course, according to Buddhism, is contradictory. How can something be a functioning thing which is impermanent, functioning, doing things, changing, and then be permanent, unchanging? But nonetheless, they hold these strange sort of views of what a self is, Atman, that the self and form are different entities, and some also hold that the self is a creator. So again, there are a variety of views. If you've studied tenets, you might have touched on some of those or seen them in other presentations. Samkhya's and what have you, all these various people who are outside the Buddhist path. They have a very coarse view of the self, this Atman, which is negated, of course, by all Buddhist tenets. Continuing with this, Geshe Loden says, within the sphere of the truth body, however, there's no such conceptual elaboration regarding those types of self, or even the non-self, or any form of duality at all. Again, remember earlier I mentioned that if we have the non-self, the emptiness of those types of self, or even the emptiness of a substantially existent self-sufficient self, which we looked at last week, which is a subtler view of self, but yet still coarse, any of these emptinesses or selflessnesses, they also don't exist inherently. So not only does the self not exist inherently, whatever one we're talking about, also the no self, the negation of that self doesn't exist inherently. So again, those are the two aspects of highest self. As I said, the highest self is no self, is being able to deny any inherent existence on the basis of these fictitious views of self or the negation of them. Let's continue on with the next slide, number 3, the highest bliss. The truth body has transcendental bliss because the obstructions to omniscience have been overcome. Again, what is keeping those arhats who have accomplished the fundamental vehicle path, as well as high-level bodhisattvas, from having this bliss are the obstructions to omniscience. They haven't removed those very subtle stains. We're going to see them again when we get into our text. They're a very important thing that we're striving to overcome, but obviously they have to be overcome after we've removed all the afflictive obstructions. That's when one attains the highest bliss. And then in terms of this, the highest, go back to our chart again, the highest permanence. This is, again, such a strange term. A Buddha's truth body is transcendental permanence or highest permanence, perfection of permanence, because it is a final cessation which directly perceives that samsara and nirvana are equally empty of inherent existence. Again, we have these two extremes that we're sort of driving kind of in the middle between in Buddhahood. I mentioned them just a short while ago. We have the extreme of samsara, where one is driven through the force of one's ignorance and delusions to continue to be in this conditioned existence. But then we have the extreme of nirvana, which is referring here to the solitary peace that those on the fundamental vehicle path strive to attain. Because in that state, they will no longer be subject to their conditioned existence, but moreover, they will abide in that solitary peace without the ability to benefit others. The Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas prior to becoming Buddhas developed this view that's in between those two. This is, again, eventually becomes in Buddhahood a sort of permanent, and permanent in quotes here, because it doesn't mean unchanging really, though there are presentations that say that if you've got the truth body, especially the nature truth body included among the bodies of a Buddha, then because that's permanent and unchanging, then the whole phenomenon becomes permanent and unchanging. That's one way of explaining it. We'll see that in what Geshe Loden presents. But the more common way that it's talked about is that this is permanence in the sense of stability. Once you attain Buddhahood, you abide in that state between these two, between nirvana, solitary peace, and samsara, psychic existence. And you will continue to be in that, not abiding in either extreme. You will have your own perfection of your own welfare and be able to be fully dedicated to the welfare of others for as long as it takes to free all beings from samsara and to bring them all to enlightenment. So essentially, that's what we mean again by this sort of fourth perfection, this fourth purified state that is arising through that its respective parts. As I said earlier, just a few minutes ago, it says the truth body transcends both samsara and nirvana and is considered to be permanent because the nature body is a final cessation. It's an unchanging phenomenon. When you have, again, something among things that is permanent, then the general rule is that you call the whole collection permanent and unchanging. But again, that's one way of talking about it. As I said, I prefer to think about permanence here as meaning that you've sort of let go of all of the things that would condition you in any other way. When you become a Buddha, through the force of everything you've done up to that point, you will stably stay in that state of enlightening others, again, for as long as it takes. Now, what happens when all beings are Buddha? Well, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I don't think the Buddha even answered that question. But nonetheless, this is what our goal is, to attain that state that is abiding in neither extreme, a non-abiding nirvana, and the ability to continue to be dedicated to the welfare of others. And we see how that is rooted in great compassion, right? If you generate the wish to free all sentient beings from suffering, to be the agent of that, well, then you keep doing that. You don't shy away from it. You don't like decide, oh, I'm going to check out a Buddhahood and go do something different with my life. You know, if you're a Buddha, that's all you do. That's your one-line job description, is to enlighten all beings. All right, so now I've gone through a couple of things to explain these various, where did I go? Where did that go? Maybe I have to pull that up again too. I don't know what happens with this. I really wish that there was a way to get rid of this that I knew of. Maybe someone can help me who's more well-versed in Zoom than I am. Where do I have that? What I want to get is, there it is. Okay, there it is. It was on there, but it must be underneath that area that I can't get to. We are on now page 103 of the commentary. So I'm going to kind of stick with the commentary for a while. We will go to some slides and other things as we go through this. But I want to go into the commentary so that we get kind of grounded again in what I just presented in terms of how it is in the verses and in the text. So we have, again, this section is called Result and Function. This is the third and fourth presentations. They're put together because Maitreya has this initial verse, in this case, verse 34, that in the first two lines talks about result, and in the last two lines talks about function. So I'm just going to read these and comment on them very briefly. We won't talk about function until possibly next class. We see the first two lines of verse 34 in terms of result says the perfection of the qualities of purity, self, bliss, and permanence is the result. Okay. And we'll get into that in more detail as we go through these pages. The perfections of the qualities of purity, highest self, bliss, and permanence are the results. These will be explained. In terms of function, our Buddha nature, or Tathagata essence, has the function of being weary of suffering, giving us the ability to generate that renunciation, and the intention and aspiration to attain peace. You know, so we have to move away from samsara and move towards some form of nirvana, again, in this case, non-abiding nirvana. But it says there, the function and quality of possessing the lineage is that it produces an intention and a yearning to attain the peace of nirvana based upon a renunciation of samsara, following an understanding of the unbearable sufferings of samsara. The development of such a mind is the work of the lineage, and this process will be established later. So we're not going to see that for, again, some time, not till next week at the earliest. Now we go into an extensive explanation, first beginning with results. That goes to page 104. So the commentary by a Sangha that Gyaltsab, this is his commentary we're looking at, he's commenting on that. It says, what does this verse teach? We see that divided into three parts. First, the characteristics of the results that are gained by the four antidotes. This is a general explanation. Then we'll have an individual explanation of each of those four results. And then we'll have compassion and the realization of emptiness in the continuum of a bodhisattva as the root of the Dharmakaya. This is the last verse in this section. And it talks about how essentially we can boil all this down to those two root causes. So let's look at the first one, characteristics of the results gained by the four antidotes, a general explanation. So we see that first there is in verse 35, a lot of fours. There's a lot of sets of four in this presentation. We already saw some of them last week with cause. So they carry over into this one, but there's also kind of a peripheral presentation of four that we're going to see introduced in this verse. Maitreya's text says, in summary, the result of these four causes, again, that were in the second presentation, is distinguished by the four antidotes. Essentially, they are the antidotal minds together with other realizations that oppose the fourfold misconceptions regarding the Dharmakaya. Now, what are those? Again, you might think that those are the four hindrances we saw earlier, but they actually aren't. In brief, the four results of devotion to the Mahayana Dharma, that was the first cause, and so forth, again, I won't go through them all again, are categorized by the abandonment of the four wrong views, the fourfold misconceptions, through the power of the four antidotes that remove the four opposing forces to the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata, the things that keep us from actually achieving them, realizing them. So to do this, I want to first mention these four wrong views are part of the overall set of what are called 16 attributes that counteract 16 wrong views in relationship to the Four Noble Truths. Some of you attended the course that I did last year, I think it was, perhaps the year before. I don't remember exactly when I did Exploring the Truths for Tipton Norberling. This is part of a pilot program that FPMT is working on called Exploring Buddhism that's meant to prepare people for courses like this one. And we see that the 16 aspects or attributes of the Four Noble Truths with the distorted conceptions that they counteract are in this chart. I'm just going to go through the first one because that's all that we are addressing here. And these are usually the main ones that are referred to when we talk about four wrong views. Even Rinpoche would teach occasionally on these four wrong views and the need to overcome them. So let's look at those four and see their antidotes in terms of this presentation. First, believing impermanent things to be permanent. You know, we grasp at everything that is changing as if it has an unchanging nature. Obviously, that is overcome by the aspect of true suffering that everything is impermanent that arises from causes and conditions, because they undergo continuous, momentary arising and disintegrating. This is the nature of all things that are conditioned. Secondly, believing unsatisfactory things to be pleasurable, those things that are in the nature of dukkha, as the Buddha explained in the first teaching on the Four Noble Truths, those are actually mistaken to be held as truly pleasurable. Now, that's why we keep going back to all of these contaminated phenomena of samsara, all of our sense objects and so on, thinking that they're a true source of happiness. But they actually are flawed, they're faulty. They are in the nature of dukkha, which we usually define or translate as suffering. That's why suffering is the second attribute, that our existence, our contaminated aggregates and so on, are suffering, are dukkha. Why? Because they're under the control of karma and afflictions, which are the true causes of our dukkha, our state of dissatisfaction. Number three, believing the unattractive or impure to be attractive or pure. So all those things that, especially our body, we have a strong attachment to this body. I think there's some sort of fundamental purity there, but there actually isn't. Our bodies are impure. Doesn't take much meditation on our bodies to recognize that fact. And it's antidoted actually, or the kind of corresponding aspect of true suffering is empty. By empty, we don't mean emptiness here of inherent existence. We mean the grossest form of emptiness of a person, which is the lacking a permanent, unitary, and independent self. Once more, this is that Atman view that I've spoken of previously. And I'll read from His Holiness's book in a moment. It gives you an idea of how do we connect purity and impurity to empty of this type of self. I'll read that in a moment. The last one is believing things that lack a self, regardless, whatever phenomenon, but to have a self. And that is antidoted, of course, by selflessness, realizing that they lack, in this case, a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, which is still a coarser form of self than the subtle form of self that we're negating, the inherently existent self. But nonetheless, this is certainly accepted by all the Buddhist, or most of the Buddhist schools, as being a necessary self that needs to be negated. Remember that self-sufficient, substantially existent self is this idea of like a controller, the head salesman in a sales department. There are all these other salespeople, but the head salesperson has a different status, kind of in the way that we think of the self having a sort of boss role that it plays in regard to our other aggregates, our body and mind and what have you. So again, I just wanted to introduce that to you. You've all been given that as well. That is a one chart that you can access, and it goes through the remaining misconceptions that are there regarding the other truths, the truth of origins, the truth of cessations and paths. So let me pull up now. What did I want to get? I wanted to do the handout. Here we go. Okay, so maybe I didn't pull that up. That would be a problem, or it somehow disappeared. This is also a handout I put together yesterday to give you a deeper explanation, perhaps, of what is all being talked about in the verse that I just read, and then we'll go back to the commentary. Because I had to first introduce these misconceptions. Now we're going to go through the chart that actually corresponds these to how we're looking at these causes and results. So remember the four causes we saw last week? Faith in the Mahayana Dharma is the first one. We saw that just now, tonight, that results in the perfection of purity. Again, that purified state of the nature truth body has natural purity and has adventitious purity. How is that lined up with the misconceptions? It is actually the kind of overcoming the misconception first in a conventional way, grasping what is impure as pure. That's the one I just talked about, right? We think that this body in particular, though we have that with regard to other phenomena, there's some sort of fundamental purity there. They actually are impure. Now, we can also have a misconception regarding ultimate truth. Our text is going to talk about that. That means that we will grasp what is impure as actually being inherently existent. Now, let me explain what happened. Let me take this off the screen. So what happens is, as you do your initial training on the path, you're introduced to these misconceptions. You know that things that are impermanent, you have to begin to see that nature because we're grasping at them as permanent. That things that are impure are being grasped as pure, and so on. The one we just talked about was that one. What happens is when you generate some wisdom that is seeing what is impure as being impure, you can still have this kind of subtler stain that is grasping those impure phenomena to be inherently existent, right? Because that's a deeper error. And we haven't even touched on that error with these four misconceptions, right? Because we've talked about things in a much more conventional way. Those things that are impure, we are seeing as pure. We have to remove that misconception first. Get rid of that grosser, coarser misconception that is in relation to the conventional nature of things. Then we have to get rid of holding those impure things to be truly existent, inherently existent. That's the subtler stain that is in there in relation to ultimate truth. Let's go back to the chart and we'll see this playing out with regard to all four of these. This is what our path is essentially about, is that we recognize initially we have to remove some grosser forms of not understanding things correctly conventionally. Look at the Lam Rim. The Lam Rim is set up that way entirely, right? The whole first part of it is to give you a better understanding of how things exist conventionally, and then to introduce ultimate truth that pulls the rug out from underneath all of those things, because rebirths don't exist inherently. Karma doesn't exist inherently. Nothing that we're taught exists inherently. So let's look at the second column or second line then. It says the wisdom realizing emptiness. Again, that is the second of the four causes. It results in the perfection of highest self. Remember that that is denying these coarser forms of self, but also denying even the that no self has any inherent existence. That's how we achieve eventually that state of Buddhahood with this highest self that is no self. It is corresponding to grasping what is lacking a self as having a self, which again is that still a coarser form of refutation of a self, that substantially existent self-sufficient self that I just explained on that other chart. But nonetheless, even if we've gotten that grosser form of a self that we've denied, we can still hold to that selflessness to inherently exist. So we can grasp that selflessness or what is lacking that type of self as inherently existent. That's the deeper error that we're making. So again, we're going to see the same thing with regard to all four of these. The next one, samadhi, this deep meditative state, treasury-like state. The perfection of highest bliss is the resultant factor that we get from that. Grasping what is suffering as happiness is the one that corresponds to this. Again, that was our second of these misconceptions in the more traditional presentation. Now, again, why does that correspond to that? Because this is a highest state of bliss and happiness. We see that samsaric happiness isn't really happiness. We see it as dukkha, as suffering, but then we might grasp that dukkha as being inherently existent. What is suffering as inherently existent? So again, that's what we're trying to overcome, are these wrong conceptions, both conventionally, initially, and then ultimately through realizing the wisdom of emptiness in regard to all phenomena. And lastly, we have number 4, great compassion, which is the cause that leads eventually to that perfection of permanence, abiding in that state of non-abiding nirvana, not in either extreme of samsara or nirvana. And that is corresponding to grasping what is impermanent as permanent. So we have a false view of things that are impermanent as having an unchanging nature. We overcome that initially, but we might then start grasping at what is impermanent as having an inherent nature, and it doesn't. So we have to let go of that as well. Again, it corresponds because it has to do with the perfection of patience. It has to do with the corresponding state of Buddhahood, where you have that stable abiding, where there's no longer any sort of conditionality. You're not going from life to life into the control of karma and delusions and what have you. You don't even have this subtler mental body that the high-level bodhisattvas have, and so on. So again, this is what is being said in verse 35, is that through applying these 4 causes, the 4 resultant states will be there, and this will be kind of the ability that we've developed throughout the path of first removing the misconceptions at a coarser level in regard to conventional truth, and eventually removing the 4 misconceptions regarding ultimate truth. Now you note that I put a little footnote on here on number 1, the 4 causes. The footnote says, the 4 causes are meditated upon as the 4 antidotes being spoken of in verse 135. So it did say the 4 antidotes, right? We saw that on in the verse that's at the top of the screen, and here I'll go back to it in just a moment. Along with meditating on the aspects of the first noble truth, impermanent, suffering, impure, and selfless, in regard to their conventional and especially on their ultimate nature. So we do it with regard to the conventional first, because that's the coarser misconception that needs to be removed, but then we have to get rid of that subtler misconception that thinks that those impermanent phenomena, those things that are in the nature of suffering, those things that are impure, those things that are selfless, still have an inherent nature. Okay, so again, we go back to that verse, we see that it mentions there once more. In summary, the result of these 4 causes is distinguished by the 4 antidotes that oppose the 4-fold misconceptions regarding the Dharmakaya. I know this is a bit complicated presentation. We have all these 4s. At least they line up kind of nice and neatly. So we have that to rely upon. Okay, so now let's go back to the text. Okay. So on page 104, this is again where we're at in the commentary. Again, we will be skipping some sections of this tonight as we go through this. Let's begin on page 104 and go through a more extensive explanation. As it says there, there's three things that are going to be talked about in regard to this extensive explanation. First, an explanation of the wrong views and the results of eradicating them through the antidotes. I already introduced you to that just now. Then linking cause to result. How do the individual specific causes, like faith in the Mahayana, result in the perfection of purity in that case? And the other three correspondingly. And then C, the specific explanations of the hindrances to the three kinds of persons seeking to attain the Dharmakaya. I'm actually going to skip that section. And Geshe Tenzin Temple, when he taught on this course, also skipped them. And I think that this section just gets too complicated, and I can summarize it very briefly. It had a lot to do with, again, the people who have attained this mental body, who yet have obstacles to achieving the highest bliss and so on. So again, let's go forward with an extensive explanation, of the wrong views and the results of eradicating them through the antidotes. We're going to look at, again, those pertaining to conventional existence, the wrong views regarding ultimate existence, and then the divisions of the results that are obtained by abandoning the wrong views. All right, so conventional, very short section. Whoops, I'm sorry. This begins in the Sangha's text, thinking impermanent phenomena such as form to be permanent, and it goes up to, these are said to be four wrong views. For the four views I just mentioned, right? Holding what is impermanent to be permanent, holding what is impure to be pure, and so on. These four wrong views exist also in those whose minds have not been affected by tenets. Why? Because they are wrong views that engage erroneously with the conventional world of the truth of suffering. This is why the truth of suffering was taught first, right? The Buddha said, you people need to first wake up to the conventional nature of things. You're seeing it all wrong. You're thinking this is a pleasure grove that we're living in, and everything is wonderful, and you don't see the faults of samsara, how it's actually in the nature of dukkha, how everything that you think is permanent is actually impermanent, and so on. And then those coarser views of itself that were mentioned there, the emptiness of that permanent, heartless, unitary self, as well as the selflessness that's the emptiness of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Then you go on, of course, to talk about the wrong views regarding ultimate existence. In a Sangha's text, this begins by reversing these up to where he says, these are the reverse of the four wrong views. On the basis of the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata, with its characteristics of permanence and so forth, these are wrong views. Now he's going to explain what a Sangha talks about, which are essentially, once more, what I just mentioned when I went through the chart. We can still hold to that which is impermanent to be inherently existent, that which is impure to be inherently existent, that which is in the nature of dukkha to be inherently existent, and so on. So here, Gyaltsab Je says, the wisdom apprehending the aggregates as impermanent and so forth directly opposes the mind apprehending permanence and so forth. That's the conventional one, right? As well as that mind's mode of apprehension when both are focused on the same object. So if I'm thinking about my body, for example, and seeing it as impure rather than pure, well, because I'm observing that, my mode of apprehension is opposing any views of its purity and overcoming that. So this first mode of apprehension above is in accord with the conventional existence of the aggregates, and therefore is an actual antidote to apprehending them as permanent and so forth. It has value. Again, that's why the Buddha taught this to begin with, because we have to begin to see how conventional reality exists first. And he says, in the commentary, though, it is stated that holding wrong views regarding the Dharmakaya refers to holding to the true existence of the impermanent aggregates. So again, we might get that the aggregates are impermanent, that our body is impermanent, our mind is impermanent, and so on. But then we adhere to the impermanence as if it's inherently existent or truly existent. That's what keeps us from achieving the Dharmakaya, right? Though the other one is a stepping stone. Again, the Buddha taught it for a purpose, as I keep emphasizing, because we have to get conventional reality first in terms of just understanding cause and effect and how things are in the world around us to some degree. Then we get the deeper reality. So he says here, to say that apprehending the aggregates as impermanent and so forth, that first one is a wrong consciousness, mistaken in its apprehended object, is a deprecation of the convention. It is a correct consciousness. It's not fully correct, though, because it can still be tainted by adhering to inherent existence. But we are still seeing things correctly. The Buddha taught those four attributes, aspects, so we would get the nature of samsara. We would understand true suffering. To assert that it is, in the beginning or continuing with Gyaltsab right about in the middle, to assert that it is not right to apprehend the aggregates as being impermanent, and that to do so is an obstacle to freedom, is actually the philosophy of the Chinese master Hoshang, who asserted that it is not right to apprehend anything as existing anywhere, or not existing anywhere, or existing as something or not as something. In such a philosophy, there can be no divisions into right and wrong. This is referring to these views that were held by that particular Chinese Buddhist. Again, I'm not attributing that to Chinese Buddhism in general, but essentially, if we hold to this view that all conceptions are a problem, until we get to a non-conceptual mind that realizes this truth of shunyata, emptiness, we don't have anything we can really rely upon. This is a philosophy that was introduced into Tibet. And there was actually a big debate between Shantarakshita and this Hoshang, where Hoshang was defeated. And how he defeated him actually was, I think it was Kamalashila. It was Kamalashila, not Shantarakshita. I'm sorry. Kamalashita was invited in by Shantarakshita to debate Hoshang. And he essentially said, well, isn't the thought of having no concepts a concept? If you are wanting to continue to diminish concepts in the mind and just try to abide in a state of non-conceptuality, you further a concept of no concept. And so you can't really overcome concepts. And of course, by this Kamalashila winning, then the whole path that came out of Nalanda and India was adopted by Tibet, where we use our conceptual understanding as a structure to get us to the non-conceptual understanding of emptiness. This is how we practice in this tradition, right? We engage in a conceptual understanding of, first of all, of the conventional teachings the Buddha gave, and then eventually the teachings on ultimate truth, which is even done at a conceptual level. And then you unite that with a non-conceptual mind, and you develop the wisdom realizing emptiness at that level. I'm not saying, again, there's faults in other approaches. It's just that this is the approach that seemed to be most valuable in terms of those masters who we rely upon to this day in terms of the tradition that we follow. So that is what is being talked about there, is that there is a purpose to realizing impermanence, for example. There is a purpose to realizing dukkha. These things, even though they don't inherently exist, they do exist conventionally. And they are what we need to define as correct views with regard to conventional reality. Then he says, also, holding no self to truly exist is to hold, of course, no self as truly existing. That, again, that emptiness of a inherently existent, emptiness of a permanent, partless unitary self is the coarsest. What's being referred to as coarse no self, though, is the other one that is still coarse, and according to the Prasangika Madhyamaka, which is this self-sufficient, substantially existent self that is lacking. And that selflessness we can hold as truly existing, because again, that can be one of the faults, as we pointed out on the chart, is that we actually might negate that type of self, but then we think that selflessness exists inherently, because we haven't touched the subtlest object of negation. We haven't begun to refute that. That has to be done again through examining the inherent existence of things and through the reasonings that we have denying that. So again, starting this line again, holding no self to truly exist is to hold this coarse no self as truly existing. Why? Because having realized the subtle no self with valid cognition, if we actually do get to the point where we realize the lack of inherent existence of the I or any phenomenon, and we keep that in mind. Of course, we cannot not keep it in mind, I suppose, to some degree, if you've had a direct realization. But even if you've realized it through inferential cognition, it's not possible to hold a tenet which believes that such a refutation is truly existing. Why? Because you've realized the lack of inherent existence with regard to one phenomenon. It's equally applicable to all phenomena. So if you've realized, let me take it off screen here for a moment. If you've realized not just the coarser view of a lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, but then you've realized the lack of an inherently existent I, because you're realizing the lack of inherent existence, the emptiness of a phenomenon that we call the I, you know by virtue of that the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena. This is said by Arya Deva in his 400 stanzas, where he essentially says, one who comes to know the emptiness of one thing knows the emptiness of all. So it's impossible to generate a kind of contrived view of things as inherently existent after you've had a valid cognition of emptiness, because you have the antidote to that. And so you can't grasp that emptiness to inherently exist through a kind of contrived point of view, because that won't arise in the face of somebody who has this realization of emptiness. It must be a coarser view that we're talking about in terms of what we are holding to inherently exist, which again is what was on the chart, that view of a lack of a self-sufficient substantially existent self. So again, and any mind that arises holding as truly existent the no self that is the refutation of the subtle object of refutation, that emptiness, has to be an innate mind. It has to be something subtle that is with us, inborn with us from beginningless time. It can't be something we're generating because of what I just explained, because you don't generate a thought of something being inherently existent once you have that valid cognition of emptiness. One might say, going back to the commentary here, one might say that cannot be so. These letters in bold that again come from a Sangha's commentary. That cannot be so because emptiness of existing by characteristics is itself the basis for an apprehension of its true existence. And yet that emptiness has had nothing to do with samsara since beginningless. Let me explain that in a moment. Let me finish what it says here. There is no fault here. As a basis for the apprehension of true existence, the Mahayana path, together with its results, has also had nothing to do with samsara since beginningless. And yet, any apprehension of true existence that results from focusing upon it without resorting to logical investigation must be an innate mind. And he goes on to talk about other things that are mentioned in Ornament. What is he saying here? He's saying here that how somebody might object and they said, well, if you're talking about kind of holding to the inherent existence of the selflessness or emptiness, well, that's had nothing to do with being in samsara in terms of you never have had that selflessness in your mind prior to this. You never have even had, of course, the subtlest emptiness in your mind prior to this. So how could you be having an innate mind grasping at the inherent existence of things, and especially the inherent existence of emptiness, if emptiness is a phenomenon that you've never known in samsara? And then he goes on to say, well, also the Mahayana path is a phenomenon you've never known, right? Because if you had, you'd be on your way to buddhahood. You wouldn't be in this state any longer. So he's saying that yet we do have innate minds grasping at the inherent existence of emptiness, of the Mahayana path. They still need to be removed because an innate mind and this innate obscurations, these exist in relation to anything that we need. They're not specific to, oh, I've had an innate conception of emptiness in it being inherently existent. I've had an innate conception of the Mahayana path being inherently existent. Those need to be removed later on the path because we can still have this innate mind rising and grasping wrongly at those phenomena. But essentially, again, we first get rid of those coarser views of no self, and then we can still have this innate mind rising that will hold to emptiness as inherently existent, or hold to the Mahayana path as being inherently existent. Those will need to be removed. But even though they've had nothing to do with our being in samsara, we've never generated those as false conceptions because we've never known emptiness. It doesn't matter because again, this is an across the board kind of thing when we deal with these innate afflictions, innate obscurations. I hope I made that clear enough. It's a very fine point, maybe not one of the more important points of this. Let's go on then to the next section. Whoops, I'm sorry, the divisions of result that are obtained by abandoning these wrong views. Again, the conventional views initially, and then of course the main ones, the ones that really block the attainment of the Dharmakaya, which are when we hold all of these various things to inherently exist, and of course hold all phenomena to inherently exist. All right, so we get to a connection to scripture. I'm not going to go through that actually. Where did that go? Oops, sorry. I went back somehow. How did I do that? Oh, there we go. Okay, let me look at my copy of it to know what I'm excluding. I'm actually going to go all the way down to the bottom of this page. Recall that I'm really just wanting to make sure that we don't get belabored by this commentary. This is where a Sangha and then in turn Gyaltsen go back to the sutras, the Tathagata Essence Sutra and the other sutra that was mentioned earlier. I can't remember, Dharani Vajra, but I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, all of these sutras, they go back and kind of track all of this stuff and correlate all of this with scripture. And that's, important for us to know that they're all correlated to these amazing sutras. But nonetheless, I think we're going to, end up spending a lot more time going through those than what we ideally should be looking at the main material. Let's go to the next section. This was the first section had to do with all of these four wrong views and so on, or the wrong views. Now let's look at the section where we're linking cause to result. And this is where we'll have an explanation to begin with, and then we'll actually look at some verses. First, there'll be individual explanations, and we're going to have a short explanation. We use explanation about every page. These four perfections, again, perfection of purity, perfection of self, perfection of bliss, perfection of permanence, which are qualities of the Tathagata Dharmakaya, are the results, explained here in an order that is the reverse of the order of the four causes explained previously. That's talking about in the scriptures. Okay, but namely, we've been lining them up just as they're presented here. Devotion, wisdom, meditative concentration, and great compassion are the causes, and they line up with the perfection of purity, the perfection of self, perfection of bliss, and perfection of permanence. So again, it means that those four were taught in an order in the sutra above, which was different, but they will be explained in the order of the previous explanation of their causes, which we saw in Maitreya's verse. Again, not a necessary thing to go through, but Sangha pointed it out, and Gyaltsab Je points it out, that essentially we're going to follow the way that it's presented by Maitreya, not what's presented in the sutra. Now we have four parts to this. These are the four perfections that we've been working with tonight. Linking the perfection of purity to its cause, devotion to the Mahayana Dharma. So, Gyaltsab Je says this is explained as reversing the love of the impurity that is samsara, desire for what is impure of samsara, which is found in those of great desire, and who harbor resentment for the Mahayana Dharma. Remember, we saw those last week. Those are the main people who have that obstacle, who continue to be kind of involved in hatred towards the Mahayana or some disdain of the Mahayana. He said, while attached solely to samsara, I mean, this is the desire that they have to just continue to be in this unenlightened state. We all have this to some degree. We have to pull away from it. That'll be the next topic we talk about, function. That gives us the ability to see the faults of samsara and to actually not be so attached to it. And it says there in the next sentence, in this way, each result is explained by way of its obstruction, the person with the obstruction, the antidote to the obstruction, and the results of meditating on the antidote. That's essentially what we have on our chart that we already went through, right? We had the first column, which was the result, the perfection, and we had the particular antidote, the cause that led to that. Then we have the person who had that obstruction, and then the obstruction itself is identified as part of that. Of course, it was in the last week's presentation. So for example, if we go back to the chart, if I can do this without totally messing things up, I may not be able to do that. Let me get rid of one of these things. It hasn't done it, I don't think. Anyway, I think maybe I'll just let it go. You can go back to the chart yourself and see how all of those four are there. The hindrance that they're removing, again, is in last week's presentation. The hatred for the Mahayana, for example, was the first one that's removed by having a faith and devotion in the Mahayana Dharma, which leads to the highest purity, and so on. Okay, so now let's go to the second one. There's a little bit longer explanation for this because we have to explain, or Gyaltsab Je needs to explain, Gilsey needs to explain this highest self. Because again, we're talking about no self. So we have the perfection of the highest self as the result of meditation on the perfection of wisdom, the wisdom realizing emptiness. So we get the meaning first and then a specific explanation of what is meant by highest self. The meaning is very brief. Gyaltsab Je says, citing first the Sangha's commentary, by reversing the attraction to the Tirthankara as outsider philosophy that views the appropriated aggregates as the self of persons and the self of phenomena, thereby holding something that does not exist to be a self, again, that Atman or false view of a self as a permanent, unitary, independent self. And by meditating on the perfection of wisdom that perceives directly that there is not a trace of person or aggregate existing by their own nature, one attains the result of the perfection of the highest self, which is the ultimate Dharmakaya. divorced from all elaboration of self of persons and of phenomena, and of course of any fabrications or elaborations of no self, that even those selflessnesses don't exist inherently. All right, so now we have this specific explanation of highest self. All Tirthankara outsiders, again, all these non-Buddhists, assert phenomena such as form, which do not have a nature of true existence, of a truly existing self of persons, or of independent existence, to have a self that truly exists. Again, they don't go that far in their object of negation. They have a very coarse object of negation, which is only in relation to the person and is only in relation to, you know, these coarser views of the self that they are adhering to. In the way that those phenomena are held as a self, these outsiders are fooled by the characteristics of that self in the way that it is held, when at all times self of persons and phenomena does not exist. But they're still under the veil of ignorance. Those who practice these coarser views of self have negated, again, something that they get to their truth, and by virtue of their tenets, they believe it leads to their moksha, their liberation. But they don't even touch on inherent existence. They don't have any concept of refuting that. They hold these things to be inherently existent. The Tathagatas, the Buddhas, with the exalted wisdom of truth that knows things as they are, have found the perfection of the highest no self of all phenomena. In the way that it sees no self, the exalted wisdom that knows things as they are is not fooled by the characteristics of the self of persons and the self of phenomena, which do not exist anywhere. This is because the way phenomena are seen by the Buddhas and meditative equipoise is the true state of phenomena and established as their nature. Therefore, it is asserted that at all times this is the true state and nature of phenomena. So again, the Tathagatas, the Buddhas, they are abiding in a state of meditative equipoise on emptiness at all times. Remember, prior to this, when you're a bodhisattva, you will go into your meditative equipoise and you'll realize emptiness directly. And to that mind, emptiness is the only thing that appears, no conventional phenomena. And they come out of that, and although they're affected by that wisdom, they're no longer in the state of holding that awareness of emptiness. And they have conventional phenomena appearing to them. They go back and forth between those. When you get to a Buddha, you've removed this obstacle of the obscurations to omniscience that keeps you from knowing the two truths simultaneously. So you will be in meditative equipoise on emptiness all the time, and you will also have full awareness of all conventional reality. So again, this is a unique view of those who have attained that state of Buddhahood, the Tathagatas, and they have the ability to hold that awareness of no self all the time, which again is being called here the highest self. Here, and that's what's going to be the point being made in this very next paragraph, here it is the no self of persons and of phenomena, their lack of inherent existence, that is referred to as self. Self as an affirmation and an independent and permanent functional phenomenon cannot possibly exist. A sutra says existing by not existing, or I mentioned earlier, seeing by not seeing. That's said to be the perfect seeing. The perfect seeing is not seeing anything to exist inherently. This means that if something existing truly exists, it should be found. However, by not existing truly at all, things exist empty of pure existence and devoid of elaboration. Again, when one goes into the meditative equipoise on the path of seeing and directly realizes emptiness for the first time, you're in the process of having, through your analysis previously, you're examining to find the truly existent self, the inherently existent self. That's the object of negation. You don't find it. It is a not seeing. It is a not finding. This is what we mean by emptiness. That's why emptiness is a perfectly good word for it. It is empty of having that mode of existence. You find a non-existence. You find a negation. This is what we attain when we achieve our initial direct realization of emptiness, and then we acquaint ourselves through it on the path of meditation to remove all these other stains. You see, I'm going to keep sharing this section, I believe. Let me see where I'm at. Yeah, here, this is an important sentence here. Here, let me take it down just a little bit. Need to, 1 second, get that arrow, do this quickly so I don't change to the next page. Here, highest self is clearly explained as referring to the no self, realized by a Buddha's exalted wisdom, which sees things exactly as they are. Therefore, other instances of highest self must be no more than the mere refutation of the self person and phenomenon. So sometimes we might say, well, the highest self that you're refuting, the most important self is the inherently existent self, but we're not kind of having the perfection of that. We're having the perfection of the negation of that. Gyaltsab continues to say that it refers to an affirmation and an independent and permanent functional phenomenon is to cling to the wrong self, thereby showing a strong affinity with the philosophies of other systems. The assertion that this clinging is an understanding of the true state of phenomena is the main object to be refuted in this treatise and its commentary. Unless you have eaten datura, this hallucinogenic plant, while studying this treatise, open your eyes and look. You will understand it to be teaching the non-existence of an affirming, independent, and permanent functional phenomenon. Again, we're negating all of these false views of the self through the wisdom realizing emptiness. The highest self is that no self. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Perfection of highest bliss as the result of meditation on the perfection of meditative concentration. This begins from the hearers who are frightened by the sufferings of samsara. Remember, that's the group, that's the fault that they have, the hindrance, and it is removed through this samadhi, this meditative stabilization, treasury-like space, up to this is the attainment of the perfection of the highest bliss. Gyaltsab says the perfection of highest bliss is the uncontaminated bliss that has abandoned even the mental body formed by the grounds of imprints of ignorance. Again, you can still have this very subtle mental body even if you've attained arhatship or you've attained the pure grounds of a bodhisattva. That is keeping you from actually knowing the highest bliss, the greatest bliss that is attained only when one, through the one's meditative concentration, is able to remove all of the subtle obscuration and attain Buddhahood. Then the fourth section, the fourth perfection, perfection of permanence as the result of meditation on great compassion. This runs from with no regard for the welfare of sentient beings, again, that's the fault of the hindrance, up to this is the attainment of the perfection of permanence. And this one is a little tricky to get, and I talked about it earlier. Let me take it off screen and just talk about it once more. Through great compassion, remember the Bodhisattva's great compassion is driven for this kind of between the two extremes. We often even talk about how the Bodhisattva's refuge is taken on the basis of fear of the two extremes, right? The Bodhisattva obviously has fear of samsara because on the path earlier, we have to actually cultivate a realization of renunciation. Just like in the Lam Rim, you have to have the first two levels before you can get to the third level and generate bodhicitta. And that, of course, culminates in the middle scope realization of renunciation. You have to get that samsara is unsatisfactory and you need to get out of there. But you also have a fear of the extreme of nirvana, solitary peace. So your great compassion is driven between these two to say, I'm going to do whatever it takes to abide in this middle way between the two extremes of samsara and nirvana, to practice the path that will lead to, through the development of my great compassion, the state of permanence. Again, permanence being here a stable, unchanging dedication to relieving the suffering of all beings. That happens when you become a Buddha. That's what we mean by permanence here. We don't really mean, again, this lack of change or momentary change. We're talking about the attainment of a state that will be there in that stable role of helping sentient beings until samsara is empty, until all beings have attained Buddhahood. Okay, so then we get a little summary at the end of this. This runs, and just to cite some things, I don't need to really go over that because it's just citing stuff in the Sangha, how Gyaltsab is finding things in his commentary. I keep hitting this thing on my screen that we're not seeing it. There's so many of these little tricky things we have to do with this. And we get a synopsis. In the sutras, the Tathagatas talked of these four causes bringing about the ultimate Dharma dhatu, pervading limitless space to the farthest reaches of time. Therefore, in the sutras, the Dharmakaya is taught by three features: its nature, its pervasiveness, and its duration. I don't recall if we see these again later. I had a footnote when I taught this previously as to what is meant by these. And there's two different ways that we talk about nature. First, when it says there, the nature, The nature of the Dharmakaya is an uncontaminated minds and mental factors. That's its conventional nature in a sense, because we're not talking about its ultimate nature. But one teacher, I think it was Geshe Jampa Yeltsin, I can't remember his name right now. Anyway, he said that that nature is referring to the ultimate nature. We could probably say it's both. It's the conventional nature of a completely uncontaminated mind, and then we have the ultimate nature, which is the nature truth body, those two purities again. Its pervasiveness. How is the Dharmakaya pervasive? We saw this earlier in that one verse, verse 27. It extends activities to all sentient beings. Remember, all beings are pervaded by the activities of the Dharmakaya. And then third, its duration. Duration is that it exists until cyclic existence has ended. As long as samsara exists, the Dharmakaya will exist. Again, I don't know what happens after that. No one's informed me. So, all right. We got just a little bit of time left. Let me see if I can finish this one section. And at least we get to this place where we're going to skip ahead a bit, and we'll begin there where we skipped ahead to when we resume next week. Alternatively, the Dharmakaya can be divided into 4 categories and extensively explained as follows. By great meditative devotion to the sacred Mahayana Dharma, remember that's the first cause, which refers to the 21 categories of insight of the uncontaminated exalted wisdom in causal and resultant phases. This is a big topic that I'm not going to go into in detail, but this is essentially one way of categorizing what is meant by the resultant Dharmakaya. The obscurations of mental affliction and of omniscience are eliminated to produce the pristine and ultimate Dharmadhatu of the Tathagatas. This, therefore, is the ultimate Dharmadhatu endowed with the 2 purities. What this is saying through these sentences is essentially that when one begins this path, we saw it on the chart, of having great faith in the Mahayana. Of course, it leads to many different things between that. It's not your faith in the Mahayana or devotion to the Mahayana continues through all of it. It takes a lot of other causes and conditions, but by dedicating oneself to the Mahayana, you eventually attain these 21 uncontaminated states and so on. You attain everything that is imbued within the Dharmakaya of the Buddha. So essentially, we attain that full purification as well as the full enhancement of all of the qualities. That is the final result of having engaged in that. Again, it's not telling us any brand new information, just adding on some additional detail. I might mention that these 21 qualities, maybe I can put them on the screen, and we'll have to find that chart. I think it's here. Oops, not there. That's the one I wanted. There we go. This is from Geshe Sonam Nodup's commentary. He says, one of the causes we looked at is called devotion to the Mahayana. Where does this come from? Someone who's already a bodhisattva or is going into this direction reflects on the qualities of the Buddha presented in that presentation, the 21 categories of insight. This is one of the things that might inspire us on our faith in the Mahayana and put in place all the causes that will lead to that uncontaminated wisdom in the resultant phase of Buddhahood. And these are listed here. Again, I don't need to go through them all individually. Some of you may have heard of some of these, such as the 4 immeasurables and so on. All of these are fully kind of imbued within the mind of a Buddha. And so you become very confident in your Mahayana path, and you therefore engage in all of the teachings that will help you to kind of get there, to achieve that. Let me see if I can get to, oh, that's not the one I want. Maybe, I'm going to take that one. See if I can get what I was just had up there. That's Geshe Sonam's other thing. That's the resources. How did I get so far from that? Take that off. I think I'm going to have to go the other way. Again, that is down here. Commentary. Go back to that. Oh my gosh, I somehow closed it out. I've got to get back to that page. Running out of time here, but technical issues. I think it's around, and this is a couple of pages. There's a couple of pages at the beginning that I remembered. So in the PDF file. Okay, here we are. We're back on page 109 of the text. Let me finish this paragraph again. There's not much more to say on the rest of these because I think they're pretty straightforward. We're right about the sixth line down. By the meditation on the perfection of wisdom, sentient beings and the external world are understood as the ultimate no self, like space, empty by nature, free of all extremes of elaboration. So that's again one way of explaining it. As we meditate on the perfection of wisdom, we remove all these false views of self and achieve the highest self, which again is no self. By the meditation on concentration, such as the treasury of space, which again I spoke to earlier, the great Lord of Dharma, pervading and teaching all disciples in all world realms. It is therefore as limitless as space. And that's where we could kind of tie in what was said earlier in that passage I shared with you, where like if we talk about the great compassion of a Buddha that ends up being pervasive throughout all worlds as limitless as space, in terms of that concentration that is called treasury of space. Because the enlightened form of the Tathagata teaches the Dharma to all suitable disciples at the same time, it is said to pervade. However, to assert that the portion that pervades the disciples of the East is the portion pervading the disciples of the West is a tenet of the Vaisheshikas and other outsiders. I can't say much on that. It's just making a very fine point in terms of how does this pervasion happen? I don't know. I mean, again, the Buddha's minds are pervading everywhere. That's the final result. The fourth one, by meditation on great compassion, it becomes endowed with the unbroken continuum of great compassion for all sentient beings for all time, and it therefore extends to the farthest reach of time. It has that duration. All right, so what we essentially went through tonight was at least introducing you to these four perfections, understanding to some degree the four causes that feed into them, the fact that they also do help to remove these four misconceptions at a coarser level in terms of conventional truth, and then at the subtler level of ultimate truth. And this is how we actually go about the process of purification to attain the state of Buddhahood, the Dharmakaya. So what we haven't covered, I'm just going to pull that back up on the screen for a moment so we can see what we're going to start with next week. This next section, I mentioned I'm going to explain this. I'm going to not going to explain this. This specific hindrances to the three kinds of person. I'll talk about it at the beginning as just a way of introducing it to you, but I'm not going to go through all the various stuff talked about there. I think we are essentially going to be jumping forward to page 112, and that's where we'll start next week. And we'll just go through the remaining verses. There are 3 more verses for this third presentation where we go into those 4 purities in a little more detail. And we also talk about how wisdom and compassion are the essential causes of all of this process of purification. So let me pull up you can get that on the screen, the questions for so again, what we talked about last week was maybe trying to stay with the topic that is presented that night. I know that there were some objections because it's difficult to discuss what you just heard, but I think there's a value to doing that. And we did talk about that and came to some agreement on that last week. If you do find that you'd want to go back and talk about the second presentation we talked about last week, you're free to do that. Essentially, you would just go through that chart and talk about the correlating columns of that chart. In regard to tonight, if you can discuss the third presentation, result. First, what purpose does it serve? That's the final column of the chart that I had on towards the beginning of tonight. Identify and explain the 4 perfections presented within that topic. Again, they aren't explained quite as extensively on the chart, but I shared with you a bit of additional information. And then it says, referring to the 4 causes and 4 obstacles that were identified in the second presentation, how are each of those 4 perfections attained in dependence on purification of each of their corresponding obstacles by way of their respective causes. This is not dealing with the wrong conceptions, those 4. This is just dealing with what's on the chart, which has to do with those removal of the obstacles, hatred towards the Mahayana and so on. All right. And then again, we won't deal with the second one because we haven't gone through that more extensively, but you can discuss that if you want because we have talked about it a little bit. I might also suggest that before next week, you take a look at the additional things I had in the slide presentation because I didn't get a chance to go through that, but it did talk about how those 4 are correlated with removing these misconceptions, those 4 causes. All right. Sorry, it's a lot of words tonight, and a lot of kind of, again, sets of four. So please break out into the groups. Those of you who want to stay on and discuss in the Zoom room, you're welcome to that. Those of you who can stay here in the Gampa and do that, we'll resume in about maybe roughly 18 minutes. So like 5 minutes to top of the hour so that we can then kind of see if there are any questions from there. All right? Okay. Enjoy your discussion. Let's see what questions people have. Are there questions from folks online or even in the Gampa here?
No question.
I feel bad that I didn't get a chance to go through all of the presentation tonight because the next two verses, 36 and 37 on page 112, actually go into a little more detail, review some of what we've done, but that'll be fine. We can start with that next week. And but I mean, again, these topics, as we go through these 10 presentations, it is a little challenging, but hopefully you'll begin to see how everything sort of fits together. And again, the first one on nature was just to give us an idea of these three, kind of the threefold nature of Tathagata essence, Buddha nature, Buddha lineage. And then we see, again, the causes that lead to the resultant state. And then we'll see the function, all these other ones. When we get to the sixth one is manifestation, I believe. And then we see that everything that follows from there, the 7th through the 10th presentations, are kind of an extension of that. So it's kind of does have some logic to it. Really quite an ingenious thing. I'm always intrigued because I find that, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, you have, well, not even just in Mahayana Buddhism, but you have all these sets of things and numbers and what have you. And very much, in my mind, a Western presentation of like things, because I like that sort of everything lining up and having a column for this and a column for that and numbers across the board and what have you. Because it's very logical. It kind of sets things out in terms of something that we can get our heads around. It's not just a vegetable soup of everything all together, and you got to try to pick it apart and see how it all fits together. You know, it's all very logically laid out. And even the Lam Rim, of course, is very much that type of presentation, understanding kind of a progression and how we move through various realizations. So I'm hoping people will gain an appreciation for that as we go through this. So no questions, no. And I also might mention to those who are online, we'll end right on time perhaps tonight, but pretty close to that. I was talking in the discussion here in the Gampa tonight, there really wasn't as much involvement in the discussion, but I really do want to keep it as part of the course. And whether the discussion is fruitful or not for you individually, I still think it's useful just to talk about the material in whatever way or whatever's going on for you. If the questions that I give you aren't working for you and you want to talk about something else, if one of the people in the group says, oh, I just didn't get this one point that Don talked about, can we talk about that? Then that's fine. Don't feel like you have to stick with the questions that I'm giving you. Those are just a suggestion. I should have probably said that earlier, but I do want people to have the freedom to use that discussion time. But I would like to keep it as part of the program simply because it's useful for people to articulate to whatever degree their understanding of the material or what they're hearing. It gives you a kind of check-in. And I also feel like if I were to teach for another half hour, your heads would probably explode. So I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't want to inflict that upon you. I'm amazed that some of the other basic program teachers teach for 2 hours straight. And it's like, that's a lot to sit through, especially on Zoom. So this at least gives you an opportunity to just kind of let go of the hearing and listening and trying to get all the information I'm giving you and just try to process a little bit. So that's my logic, my rationale. Let's go ahead and conclude for tonight then. Let me pull up the prayers. Hope I'll be able to do this. And I gotta look into Zoom and figure out why I can't sometimes share from the top there, because that menu just gets stuck. All right, let's do the 2 dedication prayers that are on the screen. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. and for His Holiness, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind and Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then the prayer for Rinpoche's swift return. Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Tathagata Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable, venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Let's dedicate lastly for all those beings that we're holding in our heart, whoever it is whose situation moves us at this time. We send this positive energy out to them so they can become free of all their problems, difficulties, suffering, and then all the causes for them to be able to find true, perfect peace and happiness and come to them through what we've done as well. And may this be so for all sentient beings. Okay, thank you all again for hanging in there tonight and hanging in there for this course. And we'll continue next week, finish off the third presentation at least, maybe go on to the fourth. All right, everyone, be well. Thanks again. Thank you, Sheila, for hosting. Appreciate it.
Thank you, then.